Hello and welcome to The Week in Art. I'm Ben Luke. This week, should UK museums begin charging entry fees? Plus, Michelangelo's final decades and Maria Blanchard. After years of decreasing public funding, the lingering effects of the COVID pandemic, and enduring questions around the ethics of corporate sponsorship, UK museums are facing unprecedented financial pressures. Some are arguing that the time has come to abandon the policy of free admission to museums that's viewed by many as key to the cultural fabric of the UK. Among those arguing for charging is the critic and broadcaster Ben Lewis, who joins me to discuss the issue. One museum at the core of Lewis's arguments for charging is the British Museum, which this week opened the exhibition Michelangelo, the Last Decades, focusing on the period after 1534, when Michelangelo left his native Florence for Rome, never to return, and embarked on many of his most ambitious projects. I went to the museum to take a tour with the show's curator, Sarah Vowles. And this episode's Work of the Week is Maria Blanchard's Girl at Her First Communion from 1914. The painting features in a new exhibition at the Museo Picasso in Málaga in Spain, and its curator, José Lebrero Stals, tells me more about this underappreciated Spanish artist who was at the heart of the Parisian avant-garde in the 1910s and 1920s. It's the last chance to take advantage of our latest subscription offer for the Art newspaper. Subscribe for as little as 50p per week for digital and £1 per week for print and digital, or the equivalent in your currency. Visit theartnewspaper.com to find out more. Do also subscribe to this podcast and our sister podcast, A Brush With, wherever you're listening. Please also give us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. Now, in December 2001, Tony Blair's Labour government introduced free admission to all national museums in the UK, a policy that in its first 10 years led to visits to those museums in London that previously charged increasing by 151% and attendance in those outside London rising by 148%. The policy has remained intact during 14 years of Conservative-led governments, but UK museums are under increasing financial pressure due to the ongoing shortfalls because of reduced visitors during the pandemic, actual and real terms cuts to museums' budgets across the country, and the increasing scrutiny of the ethics of sponsorship by some corporations and individuals. Some commentators and museum world insiders are now calling for some form of entry charge, whether for all visitors or for those from outside the UK. A recent report in the Times newspaper and a comment piece in the Art newspaper reflect a groundswell of voices questioning, however tentatively, this sacred cow of British culture. The writer of the Art newspaper's opinion piece is the critic and broadcaster Ben Lewis, and I spoke to him about why he thinks charging is the only sensible option for struggling British museums. Ben, by your own admission, you've taken on one of the sacred cows of British culture. Tell us why you want to do this now and why it is that you have such conviction that actually charging for UK museums is something that we should start doing.
Well, museums and public galleries face a number of different problems, most of which could be solved or partially solved by charging a modest entry fee. And basically museums are broke. I mean, I'm stating the obvious. There ain't much of a choice, folks. It's going to happen sooner or later. It's similar to the Parthenon marble situation, isn't it? Like, I'm sorry, we're in a new world now. You're going to have to charge and you're going to have to send the marbles back.
Right. So is this a conviction born of a pragmatic assessment of where we are in terms of government funding, private funding and so on, or a sort of strong conviction about how actually this should be done anyway, even if they were lavishly publicly funded, if you like?
Well, it's born of the need, but I do personally think that it would be good for museums to charge, because I think it would be great if people who actually went to galleries were putting money into these museums and public galleries, because it would work as a sort of counterbalance, to all these super wealthy donors, who have such a huge influence on museums, right? Because aside from the, government funding, they're the main funders.
Right. But I suppose the counter argument to that is that in the US, you have charging. That is one of the main models for funding. And then, of course, you have super wealthy donors. So how would charging not reproduce what's going on in the US and have incredibly empowered boards, in fact, more influential trustees and boards than you have in the UK even? So how would that not replicate that situation in the UK?
Well, Ben, the counter argument, right, is that you shouldn't really make a comparison with America because they don't have a tradition of massive public funding. It'd be better to compare the funding system for galleries and museums in Britain to France, Germany or Spain.
Right. But the French system, for instance, the Louvre, which has massive charges for entry fee, it's €22, I believe, for people over 26, still has lavish funding from the state. So it's matching public funding.
That's a great combination, public-private partnership. I mean, I think that's the way forward. I mean, sure, the government's still going to fund museums, but, funding has gone down in real terms since 2009 by about 30%, hasn't it, overall in Britain? Something like that, right?
Especially in local authorities. And so,
So this not charging people doesn't really work. It's not like, okay, we won't charge people and then the government's going to come to our rescue. Hello, that's never going to happen. It's the 21st century.
Right, but I suppose one of the things that, for instance, Tristram Hunt, the director of the V&A, has argued is that by introducing an entrance fee, you then immediately reduce the numbers of people that are coming. And when fewer people are coming, they spend less money. And so the retail money drops, the cafe money drops, and so on. And it doesn't make that much of a difference ultimately to the current status. And the fact is, should the energy and the imagination be put to new ways of fundraising, different forms of fundraising, other than a sort of tried and tested means of doing it, and almost falling back on the entrance fee.
Why are these people so allergic to charging a small fee to go into the museum? And the V&A is great. It's still going to be full of people. They charge people £5 or £10 to get in. I don't like the sort of moral blackmail you get when you go into the V&A. Everywhere there's a poster saying, cough up £5, or maybe it's £10 now, I don't know. Cough up £5, please. We don't have any money. I mean, why don't they just do the honest thing and charge people? And by the way, Tristram Hunt, much as I admire him, in 2011 he got into trouble for suggesting that museums actually should start charging. Uh-huh. If you do a bit of Googling, so now he's changed his position, and I understand it. I kind of respect it, but what happens now, as he said, is what we would rather do is charge people for a coffee and a cake. That's why when you go to the V&A, it costs you £7 to have a flat white, doesn't it? I mean, it's amazing. Like, we all know what's going on. And personally, I'd rather they just did it straight. I mean, it's the equivalent of a stealth tax, isn't it? Right? I don't think public galleries and museums should have that attitude towards their public.
I suppose the thing is that the collections of these museums have been built up over centuries. And yes, they are formed very often from the donations of wealthy individuals of works of art to begin with, and so on. But also over that time, the public purse has been used to buy works for those collections on the understanding that they are free collections and they will be free to the taxpayer who is effectively funding those acquisitions. Suddenly, by introducing an entrance charge, aren't you then rather negating a kind of an agreement that you've made with the public over time? And also, isn't that fundamental to the whole sell for a museum, that you say, this is your place, you paid for this collection, it's yours, therefore come in for free and see it and celebrate it?
Well, they haven't usually paid for the upkeep of the collection. That's the basic problem. I mean, you're right, it's been gifted to the nation, but it costs a lot of money to keep it up. And that's where the funding needs to go. That's the bit that's sort of missing. That's why curators are so badly paid, relative to Europe and relative to other professions in this country. That's why the British Museum could not afford, or it decided it could not afford, to spend the 5 or 10 million it would cost to catalogue all the millions of uncatalogued items in their collection. And the result of that was that some underpaid curator nicked a load of stuff over 10 or 20 years. And I'm not suggesting, right, that all curators are so badly paid that it's okay for them to nick stuff, right? But I remember my history lessons at school, and when the peasants were starving, they went into the forest and they shot the game, or they stole the bread, and then they were arrested and hung, but which we don't do anymore. But it's that kind of thing that I'm thinking about.
I guess my quibble with that would be about just mismanagement. I mean, there was a litany of aspects of mismanagement in the British Museum, the recent report, and over time we know, as we've reported very many times, that the Parthenon marbles are in a space which is frankly insufficient for them. Isn't that about mismanagement, not just about costs, and therefore isn't it more complex than saying, okay, you introduce an entry charge and suddenly impoverished curators apparently will stop stealing from the British Museum? It's a much more complex argument, isn't it?
Well, as a humble journalist, I wouldn't dream of casting aspersions on the competence of the managers of as august an institution as the British Museum. Ben, I'll leave that to you. I think the truthful answer is, of course, there's a number of different problems. If the management's bad, sure, you're going to have to hire new people, but it is also very basically a money problem. We know that.
Right. The other aspect of the reduced numbers, should you introduce charging, is that, of course, accessibility has been a cornerstone of the whole free admission policy. So under New Labour in 2001, Chris Smith, the then Culture Secretary, was incredibly committed to free museum entry. And, you know, there are the stats that say it went from 24 million visits a year in national museums to 40 million over the period of 1997 to 2010. So that is a crucial cornerstone of that commitment, isn't it? Don't we want more and diverse people to come to our museums? Don't we want to make it free for all? And especially to people who, especially in these current times, as we know, in the cost of living crisis and so on, are really straitened and would likely not come, because we have the stats that say they came in much more numbers when the policy changed last time.
Well, the European model is to let 18 to 25-year-olds in for free, isn't it? That's the Louvre and the Prado model. And I presume pensioners would also be let in for free, and school groups would also be let in for free. So who are these diverse people who aren't going to be able to afford to go to a museum or a gallery if they want to?
But isn't it about the threshold? Isn't it about, here's a museum, it welcomes me, as opposed to, here's a museum, it's imposing a barrier to my entry? It's about accessibility in quite literal terms as well as the kind of moral terms that we're discussing.
Well, yeah, then you end up with a sort of special case for art problem, don't you? Which you could call the sort of entitlement of art. I mean, why should art especially be free and accessible, you know, when concerts or theatre aren't?
Yeah, I mean, I see that argument. But again, I think that comes back down to the idea that there has been a public investment on a longer term basis, literally over centuries in some cases already. And that has been about acquiring works for them, for us. And therefore, it's an arrangement between the public and museums in a way to say, OK, you've helped pay for this, so please do come in. So it's different from theatres. There aren't any objects which are already paid for, if you like.
Well, you know, theatres get public subsidies and they charge people to get in, and it costs a lot of money to put on a play. I don't really see that as a serious distinction to make, you know, or something you can build on.
Right.
The fact that, you know, you have to buy works of art. It's almost like the reverse. You know, these works of art cost a fortune. You know, and there's small groups of curators in museums deciding, oh, we're going to spend 100,000 quid on that contemporary artist or this contemporary artist, you know, in the present day. Now, the vast majority of taxpayers who've helped fund the collections of museums and galleries over the years, they haven't agreed to pay for that. So the art lovers, the people like me who love going to galleries, you know, we should be made to cough up a £5 or a tenner every time we go to a gallery to fund these kind of purchasing committees.
Right. You said that the reaction to your piece has been kind of immediately like, how dare he say this? There's been an extreme reaction already. There's a commitment by many of us, and I would probably count myself among them, that somehow it's a moral good thing to have a free museum, you know, and it's been burnt into my soul, you know, probably because that's always been the way to a certain degree.
Well, forgive me, that's the vanity of the art world, isn't it? I mean, I've encountered that as well. Like, I don't really understand it. You know, we're the art world. Art is better than other forms of culture. It must be free. It's morally good.
Isn't it more that I just love art? We care about art. I care about the fact that it should be seen by all of us. And I also kind of love this weird thing about the UK that it says our museums are free, come in and see our collections. Okay, London's really expensive, our restaurants are ridiculously overpriced, but look, you can go to the National Gallery, you can go to the Tate, you can go to the British Museum for nothing. So please, you know, come and visit us. I feel kind of a sense of pride in that policy to a certain degree.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't think the art world is entitled to that kind of self-congratulation, sorry, or privilege, or whatever other trendy word we might use that we've sort of read 1,000 times on Twitter, so I apologise for using them, but, you know. But
doesn't it also get governments off the hook? In a way, it says, OK, we're going to introduce charging now. So the government is effectively told that it can, if it wants, pay less attention to the arts, to culture more widely. It seems to me that's a dangerous idea. Yes, we don't want governments interfering with the arts, but isn't it good to keep them interested? And if, let's say, Nicholas Cullinan, when he's director of the British Museum in future years, having introduced charging, then goes and says to the government, look, we need a bit more money. They'll say, well, no, just whack the price up a bit more. We don't need any funding from us. Doesn't it enter a dangerous territory where actually the government can say, we don't care about culture?
Well, there's always a tussle like that, isn't there, in sort of public-private partnerships. And, you know, I mean, the Louvre, as we've mentioned, you know, it costs €20 or whatever to get into the Louvre, but the French government spend a lot more on culture than we do. Okay, you know, it might not go that way in Britain. Yes, there's a risk, but actually the government might turn around and say, well done, Tate or Victoria and Albert, for raising all this money from visitors. We're going to reward you by giving you more money.
Well, I suppose that's true, but I suppose in the current climate, we don't expect it.
No, realistically, in the current climate, public funding's going down, right? And it's gone down by 30%. So not charging people hasn't really worked, has it?
I suppose, therefore, I'm arguing that what it requires actually is a public figure, and a politician, a culture minister or somebody to make a better argument for new ways of funding, to kind of, okay, if they're going to say there's no more money, don't politicians have the responsibility to present new ideas about how these things can be dealt with? Obviously, I would say pump loads more money into museums. I just don't think that's going to happen even under a Labour government that apparently will stick to the idea of free museums. But still, isn't it about trying to find new ways? Don't we need intelligent responses to it rather than falling back on existing and, in Britain at least, outmoded forms of making money?
Well, I don't think we can leave it up to the government. I mean, they sort of blame the politicians. You could do. Just cough up some more money and everything will be fine. But, we know that's not going to happen. So what about if the public art community took the initiative, said, right, well, we are going to charge a small amount. Let's be honest, we haven't got the money. We have millions of visitors. Anyone who goes to a museum nowadays, at least in London or in another major city, find it very crowded on the weekends and often during the week. Okay, we've got a large public, right? They like what we do. Let's charge them a bit of money. As you mentioned earlier, the reaction to my op-ed is a lot of outrage and possibly a lot of anger, and behind anger, there's always fear. If I just don my art historian, psychoanalyst hat for a moment, behind anger, there's fear. And I think actually the art world or the art community is terrified, that people don't really like art. And if it costs money, they're not going to come. And then our galleries will be empty. And I think that's paranoid. I think it's an unjustified fear. And I think in the 21st century, if they start charging modest fees, all those millions of people, they're still going to come to the galleries, see the public collections and see the special exhibitions and whatever else. Because actually, we live in an ever more cultural world. That's why we have culture wars. And people really like art and they're interested in it.
Well, Ben, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Ben, for having me on.
You can read Ben's comment in the May issue of the Art newspaper or on our website and app. Coming up, Michelangelo at the British Museum and Maria Blanchard in Málaga. But first, here's this week's news bulletin. Pope Francis visited the Holy See Pavilion at the 60th Venice Biennale last Sunday, marking the first time the Supreme Pontiff has attended the international exhibition. The Pope met the president of the Venice Biennale, Pietrangelo Buttafuoco, and its curator, Adriano Pedrosa, who organised this year's exhibition under the theme Foreigners Everywhere. During his speech at the pavilion, housed in the prison on the Venetian island of Giudecca, the Pope singled out the late Catholic nun and activist Corita Kent, along with Frida Kahlo and Louise Bourgeois, as female artists whose works have something important to teach us, according to CNN. Kent's graphic works promoting tolerance and peace are on show in the prison's staff cafeteria. Buildings associated with Dasha Zhukova and Roman Abramovich's Garage Museum of Contemporary Art in Moscow were searched on the 26th of April by law enforcement agents, reportedly the Federal Security Service, or FSB, which oversees the Kremlin's most rigid crackdowns. In a statement on the 27th of April, a Garage spokesperson said that the search, which was carried out in the office and archives of the museum, had been completed and that the museum continues to operate as usual. It added that the search was related to the case of Pyotr Versolov, an artist and activist who last year revealed that he'd joined Ukrainian forces to fight against Russia and had been accused of state treason by Vladimir Putin's government. Artists connected to Versolov were interrogated last month during a series of FSB raids immediately preceding Russia's presidential elections. And finally, it's Frieze Week in New York, with more than 60 leading galleries returning to the art fair hosted in the Shed in Manhattan. Among the most notable events around the fair is a new exhibition by the Italian artist and provocateur Maurizio Catalan at Gagosian Gallery. The show shines a light on gun violence and the divisions in US society and includes a work made of 64 stainless steel panels plated in 24-karat gold and dotted with thousands of bullet holes. And a 65-foot-long hot dog by the Brooklyn-based artist Jen Catron and Paul Outlaw has appeared in Times Square. Every day at noon, Catron and Outlaw's sculpture, complete with a massive bun, a fleshy frankfurter and a bright streak of mustard, is raised by a hydraulic lift before shooting confetti into the air. You can read our on-the-spot reports about the key stories and moments at Frieze and in New York more widely, in our daily newspapers at the fair and on our website or app. Now, the British Museum this week opened Michelangelo, the Final Decades, exploring the last 30 years of the Renaissance master's life following his definitive move from Florence to Rome. It covers many of the landmark moments of his entire career, including the painting of the Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel, the commission for the Pauline Chapel, and his reimagining of St. Peter's Basilica. It features a wealth of extraordinary drawings, prints and letters, as well as the newly restored cartoon owned by the British Museum, the Epiphania. The show's curator is Sarah Vowles, and I took a tour of the show with her. Sarah, we're focusing on Michelangelo's later years. Is it fair to say that he's better known for the works of his earlier years than he is for the last stages of his life?
Yes, absolutely. I think a lot of people, when they think about Michelangelo, they think about the David, the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, and these are all things that he did essentially in his 30s. And people don't necessarily think about the fact that he lived until almost 89, and he kept working right until the end. So there is this huge period of productivity and creativity in the last 30 years of his life, which we're hoping to bring to the fore through this show.
And he's in Rome. Now, he's pretty peripatetic before that, isn't he? He's between Florence, between Rome, even one point trying to go to France and so on, and then sort of gets to Venice and turns back. But this time we're actually focusing on Rome itself, and he's there for the whole time, effectively.
Yes, so we kick off in about 1534, which is the date that he goes back to Rome, as you say, and then stays there. His family are back in Florence, and as you said, he has been moving back and forth between the two cities for quite a while, but he never goes back to Florence again after he moves to Rome in 1534. So we are looking very much at a sort of purely Roman period of his career.
Is it difficult for him to return to Rome? Because he's obviously made this extraordinary work in the Sistine Chapel, but it's also a site where he feels a personal sense of failure, isn't it? Because he was doing the tomb for Julius, and it never happened, not really his own fault. But doesn't he feel a sort of aggrieved sense that he'd never been able to complete that major project, which would have taken 2 lifetimes or something anyway? But yeah, is he sort of, in a way, fretting about this return to Rome?
I think in a sense, yes, but also it came at a very good time for him because, of course, there had been this popular rebellion in Florence which had thrown out the Medici, and Michelangelo had been involved with them, helping to restore some of the fortifications against the Medici. So when they come back into power, suddenly he starts feeling a little uncomfortable in Florence. And so really the invitation comes at a really good time. And the Last Judgment is a way for him to say to the Medici Pope, yes, of course, let me show my loyalty to you in person. You're right about the tomb. The tomb of Julius II is something that hangs over him for his entire life. In his biography written by Condivi, he refers to it as the tragedy of the tomb. And when he goes back to Rome, you keep seeing these points where he hopes that he might finally be able to go back to it. So the Last Judgment is finished, he thinks, finally, and then he has the Pauline Chapel sprung on him. And then after that, he finally manages to come to a conclusion with the heirs through the good graces of various people in the Vatican. But it takes a long time, and yes, it does hang over him, and he is incredibly self-conscious about it.
So you mentioned the Last Judgment. We're in a room now which is wonderful and full of drawings for the Last Judgment, and there's a film of the Last Judgment itself so that we might compare and contrast here. Tell us about these drawings, because they are wonderful and they reflect different stages of completion, don't they? Mm-hmm.
So we start off with some compositional drawings which come right from the beginning of the process. So we have a drawing from Casa Buonarroti, which really must be one of the earliest, because there was a painted altarpiece in the chapel by Perugino, which Michelangelo is actually taking into account here. Later on, it's removed. So we move on from this very high-level first sketch, looking at then how he deals with these knots and groups of figures that really enliven the fresco and create this dynamism. And once he's settled on these groups, he then moves in and looks at these individual figures, for which we have these incredible studies really on the wall.
Extraordinary. There's one of St. Lawrence, which is just amazing. It's wonderful because, of course, you have the very famous modelling of the body, which Michelangelo is so famous for, but then also you have this incredible luminous face.
Exactly, yes. The chalk that he uses here is incredibly dense and it's almost velvety. It's really beautiful the way that he brings out the modulation of the muscles. And yes, the heads were an incredibly important part for him as well. We can see the subsidiary study here, and in fact on the back of one of the compositional drawings we also have studies for a beautiful head from the frescoes. So these are all aspects of the figures he's looking into, but just think how many drawings there must have been originally. He's taking taking this much time and care over some relatively minor figures. So there must have been hundreds of drawings. And yet what we have gathered here is the vast majority of the surviving drawings for it.
Now, can you tell us more about what Michelangelo's attitude was to painting? Because one of the extraordinary things about him is he's like, I'm not a painter, I'm a sculptor.
Yes.
So what are his thoughts and feelings? 'Cause we have letters, obviously, from that period. So what's he thinking as he's making The Last Judgment?
You're quite right. He does spend most of his career saying that he's not things that he then goes on to perform admirably in. Painting is something which it varies depending on, I would say, the medium. Fresco is something that he kind of gets used to. Panel painting is not something that he ever really warms to. We have very few examples of him actually producing panel paintings. I think when he goes back to paint The Last Judgment, obviously he's really conscious that he is working directly beneath the ceiling that he did 20 years earlier. So for him, I think expectation is quite a large part of the pressure. Physically, it was really challenging as well. I mean, this thing is absolutely enormous. It's 13 meters tall. So he was working on scaffolding and so on, not lying on his back this time, but still, it would have been incredibly physically demanding.
And he'd commented on how physically demanding the Sistine Chapel ceiling was.
Yes, there's a wonderful sonnet where he has this sketch of himself standing with his head thrown back, and you really get the sense he suffered a lot. But when he was working on The Last Judgment, he actually fell off the scaffolding at one point and damaged his leg quite badly. So, you get this sense that he is gamely painting this fantastic fresco, but it's starting to be a real physical challenge.
Right.
And you get the sense that fresco is a young man's game, and he kind of feels that he's getting to the end of the period that he wants to spend working on it.
Right. Now, you focus on individual figures that are connected to Michelangelo's world through the show, and one of them is Vittoria Colonna.
Yes.
Why is she significant, and how do you tell her story, if you like, through the show?
So Vittoria is a very important figure for Michelangelo spiritually. We look at two friendships in the show. We look at his friendship with Tommaso de Cavalieri, and then we look at Vittoria, and the friendships complement each other quite well. Vittoria is this amazing figure, and we tell her story here in the hope to bring her to a wider audience in the UK, where she's not quite as well known as she is in Italy. She is this member of this ancient Roman family. She is incredibly well known in Italy. She writes personal letters to the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor. She's very well known, very wealthy. She's part of this group called the Spirituali, who focus on the figure of Cardinal Reginald Pole. They are sort of moderate reformers within the Catholic Church, and they're devoted to the idea of the crucifixion and, Christ's body as the symbol of human salvation and redemption. And so a lot of the work that Michelangelo makes for her, poems and drawings, focuses on that symbol. And there's this amazing drawing we have here from the British Museum where he draws Christ on the cross for her. And this is just absolutely tremendous. The draftsmanship is phenomenal.
Really quite extraordinary. Tell us about his personal faith and how that's represented, if you like, through this image, because he's a man of great faith, isn't he?
Yeah.
But obviously, as you were alluding to, this is a period of extraordinary tumult in terms of religion in Europe. So does he fall on either side? And does this reflect any sort of manifesto, if you like?
Yeah. Michelangelo is very discreet when he writes letters, so we know that he was a man of huge faith. He grew up in Florence under Savonarola, so from a really young age he is affected by this incredibly introspective, meditative kind of religion.
And a reforming kind of religion.
Exactly,
right?
One which looks at the institutions of the church and says this needs to be done better. And so in this drawing here that he makes for Vittoria, he's really drawing on this idea of the powerful, undefeated, robust Christ who is on the cross but undefeated. So this figure through whom they have their salvation. In terms of what he actually believed himself, we don't really know. As you say, it was an incredibly febrile period. Stuff was changing incredibly quickly. So the section where we talk about Vittoria covers the 1540s. At the beginning of that time, it was acceptable to be quite moderate, to look for a reconciliation between Catholic and Protestant. By the end of that decade, it had changed completely, and you were being held up as a heretic if you subscribed to some of the beliefs that the Spirituali did. Some of their number were interrogated by the Inquisition, but Michelangelo's name never comes up.
Right.
So we don't know if that's because some of their beliefs resonated with him, but he didn't subscribe entirely to them, or maybe it's just that he was very close to the Pope and that had its advantages.
Right, but he's a curious figure, isn't he? Because, his letters are so extraordinary because he's so irascible, especially with members of his family, but even with people that are quite high up in society.
Yes, he gets very impatient.
But so he's still capable of being a good diplomat when he needs to be, in other words. And certainly with his faith, he seems to have trod a line which meant that he, as you say, not investigated by the Inquisition and able to be on both sides sides of the fence to a certain degree.
Yeah, I think that's because the imagery that he comes up with is something which resonates with both ends of the scale. It's something which can be admired and, used as a devotional image by mainstream Catholics just as easily as people on the Reform side. And this is something we see in this exhibition, where we have a rock crystal pax from the V&A, which shows one of the compositions that he makes for Vittoria being translated into a pax for the Catholic Mass. So that makes it very clear that people look at his imagery and they see his genius.
There's a section called God's Architect. This is one of the intriguing things about Michelangelo, again, because, of course, as we said, didn't say he was a painter, also said he wasn't an architect, but Bernini thinks of him as an architect first and foremost, right? So, and he is an extraordinary architect. So what do you tell us in this section, if you like?
So this section is making the point that architecture is running alongside and underneath everything else that Michelangelo is doing in the last 30 years, particularly the project for St. Peter's. This is really the greatest building site at the time that he gets brought in to work on from the late 1540s. And we tell the story of the development of that design. The thing to remember is that St. Peter's at this point is still largely the 4th century original basilica built by Constantine. It's falling to bits. It's way too small. They need to expand it. And they've been working on that since the start of the 16th century. Originally, Donato Bramante makes a start on it. After he dies, it's taken over by Antonio da San Gallo, who comes up with this incredibly extravagant ornamental kind of design with spires and all sorts of twiddly bits, which Michelangelo gives very short shrift to.
So he strips it back.
He's very rude about it, yes. And then he strips away quite a lot of the elements. But he runs into such trouble because, of course, the workforce are very loyal to San Gallo, and they do not take it well that he is changing it all. But, of course, he prevails in the end, and we have a beautiful drawing for his double-shelled dome, which is, of course, inspired by the Duomo in Florence. And this drawing shows the steps going up in between the two shells of the dome and the details of the lantern. And it's a beautiful thing aesthetically as well as functionally.
What I love about these is that you can see his brain ticking over.
Exactly. If you look at the bottom of the sheet, you can even see little details of figures where he's got another idea in the back of his mind that he's just getting down before it flies away.
Absolutely. And one of the things about Michelangelo, which of course is often compared to Raphael and others, is about his ability to finish projects. We've already talked about the tomb and things. A lot of the work in this show is drawings, cartoons and so on. Is he finishing much at this stage? Obviously he finished this The Last Judgment, most importantly, but does he complete many projects, or is he content to do the drawings and let others finish, if you like?
Well, in terms of the architectural projects, of course, these are massively long-term things, so he wouldn't be expecting to finish them. In terms of other works, we do see him collaborating quite a lot at this period. He is being basically placed under enormous pressure by the Pope to paint the Last Judgment, then the Pauline Chapel, to undertake all of these building projects. But he still has people who are coming to him wanting his compositions. And so what he does is he sets up a semi-formal partnership with an artist called Marcello Venusti. And we see Michelangelo producing drawings specifically for Venusti to then take on and make paintings of. And this is something which is understood with the patrons from the start. So something I'm very keen to stress, when you see these paintings, they are not copies, they are not just followers of Michelangelo, they are collaborations.
Right. So they're sort of almost stamped with his approval.
Exactly, yes.
But as you say, he's collaborated.
Yeah.
He's made the drawings, which I have to say, the drawings are just extraordinary.
They're amazing. Especially, I love the series that we have for the Annunciation because you really see him thinking through it right from the beginning, and he's trying out different poses, and they actually end up going with 2 different compositions. But even the very briefest geometrical sketches of the figures show the speed that he's thinking, and it's incredible.
And then behind us we have the finished painting by Venusti, as you
exactly,
say.
yeah.
And you can compare and contrast it with the drawing here, which is disputed, may not be by Michelangelo, but certainly would have been based on his
Exactly. So the jury is kind of out on this at the moment. There are different views about whether it's a highly finished modello by Michelangelo himself, or perhaps a copy by Venusti after one of his drawings to help him paint the painting.
Right.
But the key thing to emphasize is that when the patrons had the painting by Venusti, they were satisfied because for them that was a Michelangelo. It's his genius, it's his idea.
Does this tell us something about our modern attitude to what an artist is and what they do? Because in those days it was perfectly acknowledged that, yes, you had access to the genius of Michelangelo, but you also acknowledged that he was working within a workshop, he had assistants and so on, and therefore it was not in any way tarnishing the work to have it done by somebody else in the end.
Absolutely. I mean, Michelangelo never had a workshop in quite the same way as someone like Bellini would have done in Venice. But at this point, yes, he is working with other people. I'm not sure to what extent the modern view is entirely diametrically opposite to that, because, of course, in the old master's world, yes, we would want something to be by the artist's own hand nowadays, but think of contemporary artists who have big workshops, who have plenty of assistants working with them. You know, if someone has a Damien Hirst,
Yeah.
It's a similar question.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because, of course, one of the things about that is that Michelangelo is the most famous artist in Europe, right? He is famous across Europe. He is renowned and revered by other artists who are making works in response to his and so on. So that's one of the things he has to contend with, I guess. And there are biographers left, right and centre and so on, right?
Exactly, yeah. Towards the end of his life, someone tells a story of a couple of German tourists who come to Rome and they actually ask to be taken to see Michelangelo as if he's a monument or a site that they visit. And so he is known across Europe. He is this phenomenally famous figure. And in a way, he's the victim of his own fame because he gets asked to do so many different things.
Right. Yeah. Much to his irritation at times.
Yes.
So you have this cartoon rather wonderfully, which is in the British Museum's collection,
yes,
right?
Yes, exactly.
But you've had it cleaned and it looks rather wonderful.
Yes, so this is the Epiphania, which came into the museum in 1895, and it's just come out of an extended period of conservation. It's been off view since 2018, and this is a brilliant opportunity to unveil it. We're absolutely thrilled. It's come through a lot fresher, a lot more legible. And we are now able to see the edges as well to get a real idea of the history of the papers. So, for example, on the edges you can see the nail holes where it was nailed onto a stretcher like a painting, which is why it survives, because this is the only cartoon of an entire composition by Michelangelo to survive, because it's been framed on a wall and treated like a painting.
But you don't know if he made a painting from it, or do we know definitively that he did not make a painting from it?
There is a lot of mystery about this. So my personal view is that it was probably in response to a commission. It would never have got this far if it hadn't been. It's a vast thing. But I think for some reason that commission couldn't be finished. And whether that's because the patron fell foul of the Inquisition, the iconography is really weird. We still don't know what's going on here. So that suggests that it's come from a slightly, left field angle.
The title that you have is wrong, right?
The title that we have is wrong, yes. It's been called the Epiphania for years because that's what the clerk who's doing the posthumous inventory writes down, because he sees the Madonna and Child with three male figures and he thinks, aha, the three magi visiting the infant Christ, so he calls it Epiphania, but it's not that. And there have been various different views, and the jury is still very much out. So we hope that having it up here will provoke more debate and questions. And of course, we've brought it together with the painting that his pupil and biographer Ascanio Condivi makes after it, which is bought for Casa Buonarroti by Michelangelo's great-nephew in 1608, and it's been there ever since. And this, too, has just been restored, and so we've been able to bring them back together for the first time in half a millennium, which is pretty amazing.
Pretty amazing, really amazing. I mean, one of the things that's really interesting about this is he's kind of an amateur painter, right?
Yes,
so he's he's in the workshop, but not by any means the most skilled artist within it.
No. So, I mean, he is basically from a noble family. He wants to study painting. He's probably put in touch with Michelangelo by someone in Rome. And this is the only painting that can be connected with him. So you have someone who's really young and is essentially given this amazing present by Michelangelo as a way to help him with a leg up, really. But this is something he spent an awfully long time working on. Vasari is slightly rude about it. But now that it's been restored, I think you've got these amazing, almost pastel-y colours coming through. And it's brought it back to life. And there are some bits like the Virgin's face, which are really very beautiful.
Indeed. And of course, you get a sense from that of how difficult indeed it is to work from the drawings of an absolute master.
Exactly.
And also just to make paintings from cartoons as well. So you actually get a sense of how complex that whole machinery of making works in that period was.
But especially when you're dealing with someone like Michelangelo, who's still making changes as he's doing the cartoon, which should be the final stage. But he has these ghostly heads appearing in the background. He's moved the position of the Virgin's arm. You get the sense that his creativity can't stop. He's always thinking about new ways to try to add things in, which is wonderful.
Now, one of the wonderful things that we've referred to actually earlier on is his correspondence. There's copious correspondence. And here we're looking at two letters. What do they tell us?
So these are two of the last letters that we have from Michelangelo. So there are about 500 of his letters that survive, because from the time he dies, they're being collected and preserved. The one on the left we have, which is very short, and this is the final letter in his own hand, where he's writing to his nephew, who, as you've said, was often the brunt of his irascibility. And here he's saying, I'm sorry I haven't answered your recent letters, but he said, La mano non mi serve, my hand doesn't serve me, I'm having trouble. The thing about Michelangelo, his handwriting is always so beautiful right up until the end. This is 2 months before his death, and it's only here that it's starting to give way a bit. And you have an ink blot at the point where he says that his hand is troubling him. It's really poignant, but he says other people are going to write for me, but I'll keep signing. And we're displaying this next to a letter which is written by Daniele da Volterra, a friend and a collaborator of his. And this is written 4 days before Michelangelo's death. And Daniele is writing to his nephew Leonardo saying, he's taken a turn for the worse. Please, can you come now? I spoke to him yesterday and I said, should I send for your nephew? And he said 3 times, I beg you, I beg you, I beg you. So Daniela says, hurry up, come as quickly as you can. Michelangelo has signed it at the bottom, and you can see in those 2 months how his hand is just giving way. He's really struggling to hold the pen, and as far as we know, it's the last time he ever picked up a pen at all. And he dies 4 days after this is written, and his nephew doesn't get there in time. And when Michelangelo dies, he does have his friends all around him, Tommaso de Cavalieri and many others who've been close to him, and he has the sacraments, which is what he wanted. So I think this is the moment that we say goodbye to Michelangelo the man in this show, and I find it a particularly poignant juxtaposition of documents.
It really is. And of course, he's, as we said, enormously famous at this stage. He's also fabulously wealthy, right?
Incredibly wealthy. Yeah, he was very shrewd about money, and he spent his life building up a property portfolio, essentially, for his family. His one aim was to restore his family to what he considered to be their noble ancestry. They weren't actually descended from noblemen at all, but he was convinced they were.
He was pretty obsessed with it, wasn't he?
He was obsessed with it, yes. And he even got Condivi to put it in his biography that they were descended from the Counts of Canossa. But he wanted to establish his family as essentially, Florentine, wealthy, semi-nobility. And so that was behind everything that he did. He lived very frugally in order that his family would then benefit.
That's right. He very frugally, but he had the sort of signs that he needed to tell people that he was of noble distinction. So black cloth, for instance.
Yes. So when he died, the inventory of his house shows us that he does have these few small luxuries which are important because, of course, black dye was very expensive and it was what you were expected to wear if you were a gentleman. So Michelangelo is very conscious about those little symbols of status that he has to keep up to have la bella figura.
And there was very good cause for his handwriting to become very shaky because he was super old. I mean, he was old by contemporary standards. So in 16th century Italy, to be 87, 88?
No, well, he was just a few weeks off his 89th birthday.
There you go,
yeah, it's absolutely incredible. And you've got to remember that even just a few days before his death, he's up tinkering with the sculpture in his workshop, the Pietà Rondinini. This guy simply does not let anything stop him, and I think that's hugely inspiring.
Indeed it is. Sarah, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And finally, it's time for the work of the week. The Museo Picasso in Málaga in Spain this week opened Maria Blanchard, a painter in spite of Cubism, an exhibition dedicated to the Spanish artist who was an exact contemporary of Picasso but does not share his great fame, despite coming into contact with her compatriot in avant-garde circles in Paris in the 1910s and being close friends with other key Cubist artists, including Juan Gris and Jacques Lipchitz. Among the key paintings in the exhibition is Girl at Her First Communion from 1914. I spoke to the curator of the show, Jose Librero Stals. Jose, we're going to talk about Maria Blanchard. She wasn't born Maria Blanchard, was she? That was a name she adopted. Why did she adopt a French name when she is a Spanish person? What was the significance of that?
I would like to remember that Maria Blanchard was born in the same year as Pablo Picasso was born. Blanchard was born in the north of Spain, looking to the North Sea, let's say, and Picasso was born in Malaga, looking to the Mediterranean Sea. Pablo Picasso, when he left Spain and moved to Paris, he changed his name. The same thing was done by Maria Blanchard, that at the beginning of her career, she was signing Gutiérrez Cueto. Probably she changed her name for at least 2 reasons. One, to be in the market, in the Parisian atmosphere, known by a French name because her mother was not Spanish. And the second one, because she left Spain and she never came back to Spain. Maybe it was a way to participate in the new world of modernity and a way to forget somehow the conservative Spanish 900 artistic atmosphere.
Now, in 1914, when she made this painting that we're going to talk about, is it right she had moved back to Madrid from Paris at that time? In other words, she had been in Paris, she'd experienced the avant-garde that you're talking about, but because of the war, she was back in Spain.
She's back in Spain. She's close to friends like Diego Rivera, the Mexican painter, Jacques Lipchitz, the great Cubist sculptor, Angelina Belov, and they are in Spain. 1914, beginning of the First World War, and they cannot go back to Paris. the same as other artists like Robert and Sonia Delaunay. They find some peaceful atmosphere, let's say, in Spain. This year, 914, she paints this First Communion, this La Comulgante, a great, very important painting in Madrid. She have been already in Paris. She met already some members of the Cubist group. She met already Picasso, Juan Gris. Diego Rivera, for instance, was too exploring possibilities of Cubism. But in 914, she paints this work that don't look at all as a Cubist painter. So it's a kind of very special work because the subject, because the way how she makes, and because the size. Because she will take this painting with her 1 year after, 915. She goes definitely to France and she never comes back to Spain.
That's right. Before we talk about the painting itself and its extraordinary iconography and so on, I just wanted to dwell a little bit on the circumstances in which she made it, because is it right that she was in a studio in Madrid with Rivera? So Rivera and Lipschitz actually went to visit her and stayed with her and made work alongside her. Is that correct?
They were colleagues, they were friends. They have been in Paris already a long time, discussing about art, spending time. And the fact that the First World War starts, she somehow says to them, come to Madrid, stay with me, and they share the studio even in Madrid. So imagine the atmosphere in Madrid that was a very conservative art town, and this very modern artist trying somehow to deal with the situation. In one way, the desire to experiment the news, the innovations, the possibilities of the avant-garde. In the other side, knowing that Europe, not only Europe, was starting a very cruel and violent situation because of the war, and at the other side, thinking what will happen with us. At the moment, Madrid, quite, but very aesthetic, from aesthetic point of view, artistic, very conservative town.
Right. And of course, she's taking on in this painting a subject which is deeply embedded within recent and quite conservative artistic languages. So the subject of the communion is often very sweetly presented and presented as a moment of hope and so on. But her treatment of this subject is very, very different from that history, isn't it?
It's true. The First Communion is a traditional Catholic rite, and the idea is that the girl or the boy eats for the first time the body of Christ. But in our day sounds very exotic, very strange. But this was and is still the idea. The girl, in this case, eats the body of Christ. How? With bread and wine. This is the idea. But Blanchard paints this work when she's already 30. She's not anymore a girl. She's not anymore a young woman. She's already an adult. And this passage from childhood to adulthood, this confrontation with the sin, this kind of loss of purity that means the First Communion, she deals with this in a very special way. If you will have the chance to see the painting, the real painting, the clothes are not white pure. The face of the woman who is there is not anymore a girl. The face is somehow a very painful, dramatic face. The clothes are somehow used, and the space, the location, is not at all very, let's say, classic, Catholic, church atmosphere. She's almost pending on there. All these elements, and please try to remember how was, London in 914. I know how was Madrid in 914. This painting was something, let's say, like a sacrilege, something impossible. I would like to add that the First Communion as a painting subject is a theme that artists like Pablo Picasso, Toulouse-Lautrec or Balthus will do. But none of these three men artists painted a girl First Communion in a way that she did in 914 in this difficult context.
In your text in the catalogue, which is a very beautiful text, and I really urge people to read it, there's a moment where you talk about the stabbing feeling caused by the turbulent life experience as she passes from girlhood to womanhood. And you talk about the frozen bewilderment of the figure and how she seems profoundly disorientated. It's amazing how jarring it is as a presentation of a scene. And that sense of jarringness, that makes it such a radical treatment, as you say.
Yes, I mean, remember that less than 1 year after that she paints this painting, she will participate with Diego Rivera in a small exhibition in Madrid called Los Pintores Íntegros that was organized by a Spanish artist and intellectual, Ramón Gómez de la Serna. And in this exhibition, her as him will show Cubist painting too. This means that in this year, 914, 915, she's dealing between the Cubism, I mean the kind of new, revolutionary, abstract way to represent the world, and her necessity of somehow to project her own fears, desires, frustrations, etc. This exhibition in 915 will take only 10 days. The police closed the exhibition. They cannot make it longer. It's really, really, really a provocation. And the newspapers from the moment, they criticize in a very cruel, in a very machist, in a very misogyn way her, because she was not the stereotype of a beautiful, easy, nice girl. Maria Blanchard was different. Maria Blanchard was a very strong woman, and from the beginning trying to fight to find her own language, her own identity. And this painting, I think, somehow help us to feel and to understand better this struggle. A liberal woman who have been born in a Catholic, plenty of moral conditions world, who tries to be a woman of the 20th century.
And tell me, to what extent do you think it is a self-portrait? It is not billed as a self-portrait, but do you think it could be, even if a slightly veiled self-portrait, do you think it could be her?
I think that the fact that she, as other painters, don't want to be, let's say, a realist painting. She don't want to look at the mirror or at the photography and do it well in a mimetic sense. She finds another way to make self-portraits, let's say. Even that in no place is written about this. What we are talking is just a speculation. But you mentioned, and I think it's important, the use of a mask as a way to construct a personality. And I personally think, after studying her work a couple of years, that there are several paintings, not many, but there are several paintings, this is one, in which we can recognize a representation of a fantasy woman, let's say, a personage, fantasy woman, that somehow express the struggles, the pains, the way how she was looking to the world. In one way, there are testimonies of this, being a very, I will say, kind and very sensible woman with others, and it's possible to see this in her late period works, but in the other side, being a strong woman who is very aware that she have and she will have many difficulties to have success in a world of art where the leadership is done by men.
Now, you mentioned about the exhibition in 1915 in Madrid and that it was closed down, but the painting was shown again in Paris in 1920, and the reaction is quite the opposite, is that right?
It's a very good question, and I think it's very important that you mentioned this, because first question, 915, after these difficulties in Spain, she was not able to sell works, she had very bad critics. No one in Madrid understood what Cubism means at this moment. And then she decides to go to Paris, and she never comes back. She arrived 915, and she will stay in Paris, and 932 she passed away in Paris. How she took with her this painting that is almost 2 meters high, 1 meter 50, no one knows. First question. And second question, she was, as many other artists, participating in the so-called Salons de la Pinture. And in the Salon de la Pinture that you mentioned, after being involved in a very intensive way in the moment of Cubism, in 919, she had her first solo exhibition at the gallery Leon Rosenberg, who was, after Kahnweiler, the gallerist of the great painters like Picasso, Juan Gris, Braque, etc. She presents this painting in this salon, who is not at all let's say, orthodox Cubist painting, who is not at all à la mode, who is something very strange. The success is very, very, very big. People write about, artists speak about, and I think that this recognition that she have presenting this very strange, very weird painting help her to somehow put on the side her Cubist strategy to paint and to go to what we call the post-Cubist figural period of her work, who goes more or less between 920-21 until 932.
Now, she dies in 1932, as you say, and at that point, again, the sort of level of her fame is such that Federico Garcia Lorca delivers this extraordinary eulogy in which he talks about being a friend of her shadow, you know, this wonderful phrase that he uses. And he talks about this painting as being a famous painting. So this painting, it has a sort of celebrity. It's a work which is renowned in her native Spain as well as in Parisian circles that you just mentioned.
Well, Rosenberg, very reputed gallery at this moment, it was the Cubist gallery in Paris. In 920, he says, well, I cannot work with you anymore because I don't have money, more or less. His brother, who had another gallery, he buys the painting. So La Comulganta, the brother of the best gallerist in Paris, buys the painting. 932, as you say, she passed away, and she somehow disappears because the family of her took all the works who were in Paris, by her in the apartment, but the other works who have been in galleries and still have been not sold, and they took everything back to Spain. They have many troubles to be able to cross the border with these paintings, and I would like to remember that 936 starts in Spain the Civil War, and a couple of years after starts the Second World War. All these, with other factors, make that somehow Maria Blanchard disappears. She will be not anymore in the international market. There will be not practically exhibitions of her during some time. Spain don't know anything about her because no one was involved. But some intellectuals, as you said, you mentioned García Lorca, José Bergamín, Ramón Gómez de la Serna, knew her, liked her, write her, but after the Second World War and after the Civil War, it's chaos. It's cultural chaos everywhere, as you know, in England too. So the painting keeps somehow in a place, no relevance, and we need to wait until the 80s of the last century when finally, for the first time in Spain, will be a retrospective of her in public institution. So these factors, plus the characteristics of her life, the fact that she was a woman, the fact that she took her way, makes her more or less to disappear. If you take the time to go through academic writings on Cubism, starting from Christopher Green, going through, of course, Kahnweiler was very negative with her, and other authors, Maria Blanchard, in the Cubist studies, she's always a secondary figure. Many times people say that she was copying Juan Gris, that she was copying other people. But if you look at the work in a precise way, as we try now with this exhibition, her diversity, I mean, the way how she did her career, doing this and that, trying to be her, makes her very special. And I think that this has much to do with the feminine personality. I mean, the capacity to transform oneself, to somehow make contradictions in oneself without feeling that this is something bad. because as the very well famous writer Virginia Woolf, who wrote the famous book about her My Own Room, was written 929. I think Maria Blanchard, with her work and her life, she was trying to build her own house, her own space where she was able to do her own work. And this somehow, historically, was against her. But we hope that with this exhibition, and we are publishing for the first time, the catalog will be English edition, doesn't exist one catalog of her in English, will help at least to wake the curiosity as your publication is doing now. And I appreciate this very much.
Okay, well, Jose, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you very much.
Maria Blanchard, a painter in spite of Cubism, is at the Museo Picasso in Málaga in Spain until the 29th of September. And that's it for this episode. You can find us on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Tan Audio, and on Facebook, Instagram, and Threads. The Week in Art is produced by Julia Michalska, Alexander Morrison, and David Clack. And David's also the editor and sound designer. Thanks also to Daniela Hathaway and to our guests, Ben, Sarah, and Jose. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next week. Bye for now.